Welcome to the Urban Agenda, a production of the Community Service Society of New York. I'm David R. Jones, its President and Chief Executive Officer. Today's show deals with a politically potent issue, homelessness and youth at risk. We have as our guest a man who wears many hats. Ralph de Costa Nunez is President of Homes for the Homeless and also of the Institute for Children in Poverty. Dr. Nunez teaches at Columbia University and serves as a Community Service Society trustee. Ralph, welcome to the Urban Agenda, and I guess as the first issue we'd like to take up, who are the homeless now in your view?
Well, most people don't know. If you really to look back at homelessness as we see it in America, New York City, 1975, it was probably the Bowery individual that we're used to seeing.
Right.
1985 was a 30-year-old woman. Today, in 1995, the average age of a homeless person in America is age 9. They're children. The fastest growing segment of the homeless population are families, of which 75% are kids. People don't know that.
And I guess it's hard to condemn children who didn't have much choice in where they are.
They're actually kids that are captured in this cycle.
Right.
And if you stepped back, if you looked in New York City a decade ago, the average age of a mother was 30. Children were adolescents. Today, the average age of a mother is 19 or 20, and 80% of the kids are under the age of 6. It's a new generation. We've missed the boat.
Right. Tell us, the audience, a little about Homes for the Homeless and how it operates. And what
Homes for the Homeless provides a different sort of transitional housing. We operate what we call American Family Inns. They are residential educational training centers, and it's our philosophy that if families are captured in this particular situation, that we have a unique opportunity, especially for very young mothers, 19 or 20, very young children, to really catch up on their education. The majority of these mothers, only a third have completed high school, and the literacy level is 5th grade. Here's an opportunity to rectify that. While they're living with us, they can attend alternative high schools. For children under the age of 6, here's the greatest opportunity perhaps in a decade to take young children and begin to socialize them to education in very specialized daycare centers, to begin to provide a nurturing environment that's tied around education, around job training, and to deal with the social service issues all under one roof. It's sort of a Main Street. Homes for the Homeless operates Main Street. You're coming to Main Street, you're going to get all the services you need so that by the time you're ready to leave and go home, you're not only going to housing, but we hope to independence from public assistance.
There's been a lot of talk about who these young people who are ending up as homeless and on welfare are. What is your perception? What presenting problems do people come into your facilities with?
Well, it's kind of fascinating. People keep saying the homeless, the issue is housing. It's not housing. The issue to us is education. And when there are children and young mothers involved, then you have to say, what happened here? What did we do wrong and what's going on? We find the homeless population coming primarily from 3 sources feed it. First, there are young families that were on public assistance, and kids are growing up in these young families. We think in the 1980s, as we deregulated different industries, we deregulated poverty programs. We created a very fierce competition within the poverty family structure, and young children got shook out. They moved around, lived with aunts and uncles. Eventually, they're homeless. We are also finding, interestingly, that almost half of the homeless families we've seen at Homes for the Homeless over the last 8 years come from working poor families. We've notched down a generation of children. So for middle-class families, when in the 1980s we started to realize, young kids, I'm probably not going to live at the same standard as my parents. For middle-class kids, smaller houses, less money, less kids. For children in working poor families, right on the edge of poverty, it meant I have to drop out of school, I'm going to have a kid, I'm going to go on public assistance, I'm going to be homeless. And the third area that most people don't know, we find almost 25% now of young homeless families coming into the system are young mothers that aged out of the foster care system. So you have this vicious cycle. They're coming out of foster care, they're 18, they have a family, here they are. This is why the population's getting so young, and this is why the issue doesn't go away.
I guess, you know, obviously the new conservatives in Congress have already made this the major issue, really, about reducing the number of benefits going to poor people and particularly people and young women on supports. Are they going at it the right way?
Well, I don't know that they're going at it the right way, but I do think it's a good time to step back. I don't know that we've gone at it the right way with homeless families up to this point and say, look, exactly what is this issue? If it's not housing and you're telling me it's young mothers and young kids, then what do we do about it? If we're not careful, what I spoke about a few moments ago about really shaking families down notching them down a poverty ladder, we'll do it again. We'll take more families that are on the fringe. Maybe this time these kids are going to come from middle-class families, from blue-collar families, and shake them down into the system. The goal is not to penalize anyone, not to say if you have another child, you're going to be penalized. Then we're penalizing another generation. And if we remove kids and put them in orphanages, as they talk about, we're going to send young mothers to shelters. The cost is going to be 3 or 4 times a year what it has to be. We can make a right turn here for a change. We can do something very different. We can recognize that education is the key. If we're really going to deal with this, we have to give these kids, parents and kids, education. We have to teach them family norms because it's not existent here. You know, there's a fact. People hate when we talk at Homes and Homeless about these families have problems. They say, you're stereotyping. They're wrong. When you have a young mother who has 2 or 3 kids and each kid has a different last name, you have a family problem. You have to really question what has happened to family values. And that doesn't mean they don't have values, but what is short-circuiting? The socialization of more normal values. We find when a family comes in, once we can give them education, we see dramatic change in the parent. We see phenomenal growth in the child. Then we can move to not job training, because you can't train a young woman with a 5th grade literacy level. You have to job ready her. What it is to get up, to go to work, to put your child in daycare, to prepare, to really take responsibility and take some orders on the job. Then you can really start to socialize them into independence.
It's interesting, when I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there were kids on my block who had never been outside a 5-block area. All they knew was the little confines of that. Now, I went off. My parents were both working and pushing like crazy. But I'd go back to those neighborhoods, and for many years, I'd see the same kids who I grew up with, who were as bright as I was or more so, who were still sitting on those stoops. They never had any idea of a worldview beyond that small radius. I don't think people understand, who haven't been in these communities, how isolated youngsters had. And in terms of the inputs of different options and different ways of living, it's not there.
Well, that's where this becomes interesting. When you say, you know, are they beginning to look at in Washington? They have to take a hard look. Because if we can give these young families options, we can see change. What we're talking about is really taking them. You know, we're not talking about removing anybody. These families are here. If you want to know who the poorest of the poor are, they're the homeless families. This is their safety net, shelters. I mean, this is where they've ended up. So if their whole infrastructure across America, you have all these families right now, now is the time not to split families up. It's not family separation, it's preservation. And you simply change what's going on under the roof of that facility. Take the word emergency out, because it's not an emergency. It's an educational family issue. And you can really start to change for an entire segment of the population in the future. You can rewrite it.
You know, it's one thing we've been dealing with, as you know, at Community Service Society, looking at the educational supports to poor children and poor communities, and looking at the inequity that's developed over the years, and just in terms of the curriculum and supports that go to poor children. And it was interesting, I went back to my old public school, PS 138, that's in Crown Heights, and the problems that I saw growing up in the 50s, of no books, of too many substitute teachers, of just not the same curriculum, getting a kid ready, particularly in areas like math and science, have gotten worse in the time since I was there. And obviously that doesn't impact every poor family, but it certainly makes it that much more difficult to get the basic rudiments of an education to go out there and seek any kind of employment.
Oh, it absolutely is. We have, you know, in our facilities, we have 540 families on any particular night. So you have kids from infants all the way up to teenagers. We've had to introduce accelerated after-school programs in science and math because the average homeless child is 2 years behind. 28% of these poor homeless kids are put into special education, not because they have any kind of a physical disability or educational disability. It's because they've been left behind. They're being stereotyped. In these accelerated after-school programs, they operate every night of the week. We have these kids in 6 months. They can compete at the reading level, the math level, the science level as kids in a public school. So the emphasis is education. It can be done, and it is being done.
You know, one of the interesting things, I try to keep up with my son who just entered the 9th grade, or is mid-year already, and I try to keep up with his math work now. And it's impossible for me, and I was always pretty good at math, but not that great. And you start to realize that unless the sort of the floor is put in for kids when they're very young in terms of basic math concepts and other concepts, that when they get to high school and are asked to do a curriculum across the city or across the nation, and they have no preparation for it, it becomes an impossible hill for them to climb. So this question of early intervention, particularly in education, becomes obviously doubly important as we get more and more competitive for high schools.
It's key, and as we teach these kids in science and math, it's all done on computers because they need those tools. But I'll give you an interesting spin on it.
Right.
When we're doing these with young kids, the adolescents, so on, all of a sudden, the parents started coming down. Here comes a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old mother who's suddenly saying, my child is doing computer work. I don't even know what this is. Our after-school accelerated programs are now full of not only the kids, but the parents. So it does work. This is a whole family educational process that takes off.
Well, I guess in these times of fiscal stringency, I have to ask the hated, the awful word. Does this cost more than just leaving people alone? Can this bankrupt the government?
Absolutely not. I can tell you how. You have a family sitting in a welfare hotel today. You're paying over $130 on average for a family to sit there and do nothing in a single room. Less money, significantly less. In fact, $33 a person a day is what the government pays us to provide all of these services: health services, educational services, social services, job readiness, job training services, on site under one roof. There's a cost effectiveness here, but you have to do it right. This is not hand-holding. There's accountability, responsibility. And once you begin to show families, the government comes and says, this is interesting. So what are we getting for our dollar? We're quantifying it. And it's not only government. I should mention there are private sector partners here also. A big benefactor of our organization is Hart's Industries and Leonard Stern, who finances a great array of educational programs for prevention of children going into foster care in our sites. Merrill Lynch does our after-school accelerated programs. Chemical Bank, Citibank. There are partnerships. When you show the private sector and you show government what you can do and what the results are, and you show them that it's a children's issue, there's no question as to who's going to participate and what you can do.
What you mentioned earlier in your remarks about many of the youngsters you're seeing, the young mothers you're seeing, are coming out of the foster care system. Explain, what is the linkage between foster care and homelessness? How is that working itself out?
Well, basically any child who's in foster care, I'd go as far as to say anyone who's in foster care and is going to age out is going to be homeless. They have no place to go. Their opportunity to really become independent and enter the normal stream of society, very small probability. So they end up, young mothers end up starting a family very soon, and then they end up in a city emergency assistance unit, welfare hotel. Maybe they'll move in with a few friends for a while, but they all end up in a shelter eventually. And the foster care system, we have found that families that come from foster care, young parents, have the most chronic degree of problems. Domestic violence, 50% of our population has domestic violence. Almost 70% have a substance abuse problem. And it's not necessarily crack like people think. As the population's gotten younger, became teenagers, it's alcoholism. Okay? And so they're coming already with a history of going into foster care themselves for physical and neglect and abuse. And we find that they have the highest probability of inflicting the same characteristics to their children. So that is the highest at-risk population. And if you look at the correlation, in New York City, homelessness in a decade has grown 500%. Foster care in a decade has grown over 300%. There's a correlation, and we have to really watch what we're doing. So you need very sophisticated family preservation programs on site in these residential educational training centers. We run crisis nurseries where we can actually remove a child up to 30 days without a legal separation. The family is here and work with both segments of the family to keep the child and family together.
So you're not agreeing that orphanages is the way to go?
No, orphanages are not the way to go. I'm saying perhaps family inns are the way to go, and we can work with a whole family at once. I don't think that any one element, if it's made to stand alone, a child and a parent, it's not going to work. If you put them together and work with this under one roof, because what we're really running are communities. Think of it as a multi-service community center where you're living, your service is downstairs. Your child goes to school downstairs, you go to school downstairs, you go to your social worker down the hall, you deal with a nurse or a doctor down the hall. You have all of this. It's a nurturing environment. Think of it as a university. It's a school. You know, we send wealthy kids off to boarding school. Maybe we should really deal with those less fortunate and see how this works.
What do you think about the suggestion, which I think many of us in the advocacy community are not necessarily dismissive of obviously work requirements for people who are on welfare and in this condition? Are there enough jobs for people with no skills, or can we ready people to participate in work-related activity?
I think it's two-tiered, and I think the issue of having people work, making them responsible is good, because I think responsibility is a very important element here. And I think with the family population, since it's so young, it's very important to instill it very fast. But going for a job, you need to be job ready. Yeah. It comes back to what I've said, not even trained yet. In our facilities, how we've tried to deal with this, we try to make it a whole cycle while a parent's in school, a kid is in school. A parent chooses, after they've been with us several months and they're ready, a different profession. They can be a teacher's aide, they can work in security, maintenance, or they can work as a paraprofessional in social work or clerical. Choose your profession. And you begin to work 5, 7, 10, up to 35 hours a week. You're punching a clock. You're being made responsible. You work with another employee. So here, right away, is a role model, a peer to work with. So everyone chooses a profession, and these mothers are being job ready. Now, are we training them in the greatest employment areas? No, but people who work in our facilities are living independent, our regular workers on this. And we also, though, at the same time, are starting them off on education. Because if we're really going to make people go to work, and we're really going to make them independent, and I don't mean just living independent, I mean off public assistance, then we've got to get them ready for the jobs of the future, and that's the key you talk about. All of these parents and kids have to be bombarded with computer programs. They have to be taught the skills that are going to allow them to become more independent later. We now have 18% of the young mothers that are in our facilities, and 8,000 families have come through our facilities, going on to higher education. That's a very important variable. We have families, when we put them in permanent housing, we're getting them good jobs. They're working with MTV. I mean, they're getting into regular industries. So it can be done. And then it does really begin to give a totally different tone. A mother says, I can do it. In 10 years, I never thought I could be this independent. And that becomes a role model for the child. And it's a family role model. Right. That's the right model.
They're all connected up.
They're all connected.
Do you see any of this, well, almost conservative hysteria with the real potential of even wiping out sort of mainstream experiments like your own, which pick up family values and pick up ideas of family preservation? Are those going to be threatened as well in this shift, saying do away with it all kind of attitude?
Well, I think everything's up in the air. But you know, when you come back down to it, if the population's gotten this young, and you don't see homeless families on the street,
no,
because they find a place for the night, at least for now.
Right.
But start to play with the numbers. Start to push more families down. Start to watch the creep up the ladder, the economic ladder, and you'll see enough of a scream in this public. And you know what? I don't understand what a mayor doesn't take. Come on television and say, you know something, the whole homeless thing, the whole homeless crisis that so many of us are so tired of. I talk about quality of life. It's a young mother, she's 19, and have 2 or 3 kids and say, this is the average age of a homeless person in our city here. Look at this. The public will support this. If you show the public a rational plan that's not forever, short time period, you can make a change, we can do something different, I think they'll support.
To support that belief, there was an article in the New York Post recently by Ed Koch, our former boss, where the mayor was saying, he was talking about juvenile crime, and after saying all the bad things about what you have to do with juvenile criminals, many of whom are black and Latino, he did point out that early intervention and grabbing these youngsters, and his idea with civilian volunteer corps and even Cub Scouts or whatever, was where he made the thrust of his article. And I think our mayor, our former mayor, certainly represents a conservative to mainstream voice, but there is a growing recognition that there's going to be a causal relationship with leaving this many people, and particularly very young people with no moral center because they've lost so much in their communities, adrift with no hope. And I think when it starts to move into even conservative circles where it's being talked about, there is going to be a reevaluation that we have to be there to help, I believe.
Right.
But I think some of the other things we'd like to talk about are obviously the institute you're working on and putting together. I think the audience would be interested to hear what you're planning to do with that.
Right. Well, the institute actually grows out of what Homes for the Homeless has done. We've been asked to travel around the country and speak about the different programming we've done, the experimental programming, what works and what doesn't. Something had to be done. The Institute now serves as our research arm and our technical assistance arm. We provide training for other nonprofits, City of New York, on an ongoing basis on different programs we're doing. We've written them into curriculums for all groups. We feel anyone who's dealing with homeless families should be doing something that we are doing. Maybe not all of it, but something we have for everyone. So the Institute does that. The other thing, we believe that there's not enough research on homeless families. A lot of rhetoric, a lot of anecdote, everyone I know a family, but when you're talking about tens of thousands, when you think as we sit here, 6,000 families will be housed tonight in emergency shelters, and there are many more thousands just because they can't get in, they're not there, then we ought to start to quantify and see what is the nature of the problem. No one knew a decade ago we've spent $1 billion No one said, hey, maybe we're going to have a different generation soon. Hey, maybe the issue just isn't housing. Hey, what are the characteristics of these families? You know, 10 years ago, mother had work experience and 2/3 completed high school. What have we done wrong? So the Institute's job is to do research, disseminate reports, to publish on this so that we get a better understanding, so that when government comes back, as it is now, and saying we're going to make cuts, look, don't make them here because we can show you the quantification. We can show you how the dollar is appropriately spent.
You raised housing. There's an interesting sort of change that's going on that hasn't been focused on as much as the question of welfare reform. But there is talk about major changes at the Office of Housing and Urban Development, of perhaps doing away with housing authorities or making some major change.
Yeah.
What do you think that would have as an impact on the communities you're looking at? Would that have any impact if they start tinkering with that?
Yeah, it is an absolute impact. You know, I don't emphasize housing doesn't mean I don't think it's important.
Right.
I think it's secondary to what the real issue is. If we start to really turn off that housing and we start to really privatize it in such a way that it becomes more competitive and there's no longer any guarantee that families with lower incomes are going to be able to afford it, this issue is going to backwash on us much, much more. I think one goes one hand in the other, and I think this is part of the reward system. If you buy into this to a young mother, and you're going to complete your education, we're going to make you job ready, get you jobs, get you independent from public assistance, you and your child, which you want. I've yet to meet a young mother who doesn't say to me, 2 years I'm out, although it doesn't happen. Then we will help you get housing, affordable housing, and we will get you into permanent housing and then get you employed. I think one goes with the other, and I think we better be very careful again. In this country, we're so fast, that gun comes out of that holster quick, and we shoot it up, and then we say, oh, look at the damage we did.
Well, it's interesting because we were looking at the New York rental market, for instance, and we know that there are almost 100,000 families are backed up waiting for public housing, and public housing ain't no joke for any of you who have visited in the audience. But obviously the HUD changes could mean that people would get a voucher. And that may work, obviously, in a rental housing market that's doing well, but there is no capacity for people to get houses in New York. There are no open apartments at the very low end. And you may have your voucher to wave around, but there are no houses to rent at that price. And clearly they haven't thought that one through yet. It doesn't mean it won't work in some areas of the nation, but obviously on New York it could be extraordinary. The other thing that is interesting, you talked about a public-private collaboration. There's always been the discussion of where the private sector should play in terms of trying to address this issue. And one of the arms, obviously, and one of the avenues is, are they going to be able to provide the jobs for low-skilled and semi-skilled and unskilled people? One of the other issues are, does private industry have a stake in how people do in this system? Is, for instance, increased homelessness a threat to private businesses in the city of New York or Chicago or elsewhere, in your view?
I think this is a threat to industry, to society, and I think they go hand in hand, because you have to put your company in some environment, you have to work in some environment, and you're responsible for the environment. It goes kind of this way. You know, I spoke about different trades where families work when they're with us. Any company, whether it be a bank, has daycare for their employees. You can employ these people. They have security, maintenance, food services. You can employ these people, and I think because we're all taxpayers and we all pay, there should be some government responsibility to this. If we're going to change the character of this in America, and we're looking at it now, we're going to have all these great reforms, then we ought to reform to another degree who the players are. There's no reason why industry shouldn't hire. Anyone who does business with Homes for the Homeless has to hire X number of employees a year based on their level of business with us, even if it's 1 or 2 families. Those are families that are becoming independent with this corporation, that corporation, that corporation. Banks, instead of just having them required, oh, you must do some community development work, should also hire some people to make them independent to live in that community so they can develop.
Ralph, you've just written a book, Homes, Dreams, and Promise, The Future of Homeless Children in America. We have a copy here. Would you tell us what that book goes over?
Basically, this book takes it home. It goes back and says, you know, it's misunderstood in America. Yeah. We have not made a national public policy to deal with homelessness, and we have not recognized homelessness as a children's issue. And no one has stood up and said, look, it's education first. If you just move a family to permanent housing, you're warehousing poverty. Prepare them and move them, you're really making the right solution. You're changing the nature. This book addresses that. It takes you through how we got to homelessness in America and then in New York, and then it gives you several chapters of solutions.
Now, you know, obviously we've been hearing a lot from Washington, but very little that tracks what you're talking about as of yet. Have we started to hear public policy people talking this language, or starting to come around to your way of thinking?
Surprisingly, we are. Homeless and Homeless has been getting a lot of experimental money from HUD and Health and Human Services to deal with the educational components here, the employment components. You know, our success rate, when we go to Washington, we've been quantifying it for years. 94% of the families that we move on to permanent housing are successful 4 years out. They don't return. So if you find what's right, let's replicate it. That's what Washington has to do. I mean, we're not the only group. Across America, there must be people solving these problems in a dozen different ways. Let's bring it together. So there is reception. I don't think anyone wants to be stuck in this situation, but somebody better stand up and point the right direction and make it happen there.
You talked about going around the nation, and I know you give speeches all over the place. Are you finding receptive audiences in other parts of the country who have similar problems, or are we just dealing with New York City?
Oh, no. I'll tell you, I'll give you some real scary stuff. In Burlington, Vermont, we're on the border of Canada.
Whoever heard.
We're talking there, and there are homeless families. They say, well, you know, it's not such a big issue here. Do you have a shelter in Burlington, family shelter? Yes. There's a waiting list. It's a big issue. Get it? In Colorado, you know, in the suburbs of Colorado, homelessness has taken the same turn as we see in New York. Families have gotten younger, kids are younger, the educational curve is down. They're just a different ethnic group. It's the same issue everywhere in America, and it's growing, and the word homeless is the wrong term perhaps to put to it. This is the most severe chronic poverty we've seen in America since the 60s and certainly the 30s, and it is so young that it's frightening.
I think part of the thing we see and have to confront, obviously, is the notion of homelessness has started to be confined to, in many people's minds, to blacks and Latinos living in urban poverty. But I guess we're getting the sense also that it's spread well beyond that. I've run into congressmen representing blue-collar, working-class white communities in Illinois who are seeing kids who have never worked, whose fathers and mothers worked on assembly lines with good wage, and now things are coming apart.
That's right.
So I think giving the notion that no one is exempt from this just because it's confined now to certain groups, or not even as you're describing confined, is going to be one of the key responsibilities of advocates as we go along.
It's an important thing to understand. You know, we're all on this mountain, we're sliding down, and nobody's pulling us up. And little by little, families are going off the edge.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
Thank you.
Homelessness is an unenviable condition for anyone. But for children who are part of a homeless family, it is especially horrific. The infant mortality rate is more than double that for the general population. Homeless children are also targets of malnutrition, educational deprivation, and emotional neglect. A civilized country must not allow an accident of birth to predestine an innocent child to a life of despair. All our children need and deserve to be nourished and cherished by a caring society. They are our future. This is David R. Jones for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.